For more than 40 years, a piece of Albert Einstein's brain sat inside a cardboard box in the back seat of a Buick Skylark, carried across the country by a man who was never supposed to have it in the first place. Not a museum. Not a laboratory freezer with proper documentation. A cardboard box, once used for cider, sitting in the trunk or the back seat, moving from state to state, city to city, for over 4 decades, in the possession of a single obscure pathologist who had quietly decided, on one ordinary morning, that this was his to keep. This is the story of how that happened, why it took 30 years for anyone to properly examine what he'd taken, and what his decision reveals about the strange, uncomfortable place where scientific curiosity quietly turns into something closer to obsession. A quick warning before we go further. This one is grim, and every word of it is true, including the part where the man responsible for all of it ends up, decades later, driving across America with the granddaughter of the man he'd stolen from, trying to hand back the pieces nobody had ever agreed to let him take. Princeton, New Jersey, April the 18th, 1955. Albert Einstein had died a few hours earlier at Princeton Hospital of a ruptured aortic aneurysm at the age of 76. He had specifically and repeatedly asked in life that there be no funeral, no grave, no shrine. His body was to be cremated, his ashes were to be scattered somewhere private, and the location was never to be made public. He wanted, in death, exactly what he had rarely gotten in life: to be left alone. A standard hospital autopsy was scheduled, a routine procedure required to formally confirm the cause of death. The pathologist assigned to perform it was a man named Thomas Harvey, 42 years old, competent, quiet, and by most accounts entirely unremarkable in his career up to that point. Harvey opened the body. He examined the organs. He noted the ruptured aneurysm exactly where the medical team expected to find it. And at some point during that routine procedure, working alone in the hospital's basement, he made a decision that no one else in the building had approved, and that he had no legal authority to make. He removed Einstein's brain from the skull. He weighed it, 1,230 grams, entirely unremarkable for an adult male, no larger or heavier than an ordinary brain. And instead of returning it to the body before it was released to the funeral home, he kept it. There was no research protocol waiting for it. No ethics board had signed off. No family member had been asked, let alone agreed. Einstein's own son, Hans Albert, was still alive and had explicitly not been consulted about anything beyond the standard autopsy. As far as the family understood, their father's body would be cremated whole, exactly as he'd asked. Harvey placed the brain in a jar of formaldehyde. He photographed it from multiple angles. And then, in the days that followed, he did something that turned a single act of quiet overreach into a lifelong project. He had it cut into roughly 240 separate blocks and more than 1,000 thin slides, prepared for microscopic study, distributed in small collections that he would spend the rest of his life trying to place with researchers who might make some scientific use of them. When the story became public, and it did fairly quickly, once a journalist tracked down what had actually happened in that basement, the reaction was immediate. Einstein's family was understandably furious. Hans Albert Einstein was reported to have been deeply upset that his father's specific, explicit wishes had been overridden without so much as a conversation. The hospital was embarrassed. And Thomas Harvey, the mid-level pathologist who had taken it upon himself to make this decision alone, was fired from Princeton Hospital not long afterward. He did not, however, give the brain back. Instead, over the following months, Harvey negotiated something with the family that has never been fully documented in writing, something closer to a reluctant, informal permission granted after the fact than any real consent given in advance. The most commonly cited account is that Hans Albert Einstein eventually agreed to let Harvey keep the specimen on the condition that any research conducted on it be for serious scientific purposes only, published in respected journals and never sensationalized. It is worth sitting with how strange that arrangement actually was. The brain had already been removed without permission. The family's approval, whatever form it actually took, came only after the fact. Only once refusing to grant it would have meant fighting a public battle over a piece of one of the most famous men on Earth. And the man now holding what remained of Einstein's brain was not a neuroscientist, not a researcher with any specific hypothesis he intended to test. He was a general pathologist who had lost his hospital position over exactly this decision. now personally responsible for one of the most sought-after specimens in the history of science, with no institution, no funding, and no real plan. It also helps to understand exactly how little legal protection existed at the time to stop something like this from happening in the first place. In 1955, the concept of informed consent, in the specific documented sense we understand it today, barely existed as an enforceable medical standard. Hospitals routinely performed autopsies with only the loosest family authorization, and once a body was inside the hospital system, decisions about what happened to individual tissue samples were, in practice, left almost entirely to the discretion of the pathologist holding the scalpel. There was no specific law Harvey broke by removing the brain. There was no formal review board he was required to answer to. The only real check on his behavior was supposed to be professional ethics, and in that one moment, alone in a basement, professional ethics simply weren't enough. What followed was not a research program. It was closer to a wandering, decades-long act of custodianship by a man who seemed to genuinely believe he was protecting something important, without ever quite figuring out what to do with it. Harvey moved, repeatedly. Through the 1960s and 70s, he relocated across several states: New Jersey, then Missouri, then Kansas again under different circumstances, taking new jobs, in some cases modest ones, far removed from prestigious research pathology, and each time, the brain moved with him. Not shipped through any formal scientific transport, simply packed, along with the rest of his belongings, kept close enough that he always knew exactly where it was. At one especially well-documented point, the remaining slides and tissue samples were kept in that cardboard cider box, tucked inside a duffel bag or cooler in the back of Harvey's car, as ordinary and unremarkable to look at as a box of old files. A man could have searched that car and found nothing more alarming than paperwork. For most of this period, Harvey sent small samples to any researcher who formally requested them and seemed credible, but he coordinated no unified study of his own. He held on to most of the material. Meanwhile, actual mainstream neuroscience mostly moved on, treating the specimen as a minor historical curiosity rather than a serious research subject, largely because Harvey himself had no formal neuroscience training and no research infrastructure to properly study it, and because so much time had simply passed since anyone credible had properly catalogued what he even had. Harvey was not, as it happens, participating in some entirely unprecedented practice. The impulse to physically preserve the brain of a singular mind, as though genius itself might be visible under a microscope, has a much longer and stranger history than most people realize. Following the death of the Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin in 1924, an entire dedicated research institute was established in Moscow for the specific purpose of slicing his brain into tens of thousands of sections, searching for a physical basis for his political genius, a project that consumed the working lives of multiple scientists across several decades without ever producing a conclusive answer. Similar, smaller efforts followed the deaths of other prominent 19th and 20th century intellectuals, based on the same unproven assumption running underneath all of it, that extraordinary minds must leave some extraordinary, visible fingerprint on the physical tissue itself. Harvey almost certainly knew of at least some of this history. What set his case apart was not the underlying impulse, which turns out to be a fairly old and recurring one, but the complete absence of any institution behind it. Lenin's brain, whatever the scientific value of the project, was at least studied inside a properly funded, purpose-built laboratory with a formal staff and a clear chain of custody. Einstein's brain spent its first 3 decades in the personal possession of one increasingly itinerant man with no equivalent structure at all. It was not until 1985, 3 decades after Einstein's death, that the first significant scientific paper based on the tissue was finally published. A researcher named Marion Diamond at the University of California, Berkeley, had spent years trying to obtain samples from Harvey, corresponding with him by mail, before he finally sent her several small blocks of tissue, reportedly packed in a mayonnaise jar. Diamond's study reported a higher-than-average ratio of glial cells to neurons in a specific region of Einstein's brain, and speculated that this might relate to enhanced cognitive processing. The finding was controversial from the start. The sample size was 1, the comparison brains were of uncertain quality, and many neuroscientists considered the conclusions far too speculative to support the headlines it generated. But it was, after 30 years, the first time anyone had actually tried to turn Harvey's improvised custodianship into something resembling real science. More studies trickled out over the following decades. In 1999, a researcher named Sandra Whittleson published findings suggesting an unusual pattern in the parietal lobe, a region associated with spatial and mathematical reasoning, along with the notable absence of a particular groove found in most human brains, though again drawing firm conclusions from a single specimen. Examined so long after death, and after so many years of improvised handling, remained scientifically fraught. A later analysis in 2012, led by researcher Dean Falk, worked not from fresh tissue, but from a set of photographs Harvey had taken back in 1955, since so much of the physical material had by then been dispersed, damaged, or simply lost track of. Other researchers who examined fragments over the years reported a handful of additional anatomical differences, an unusually complex folding pattern in parts of the prefrontal cortex, an atypical thickness in certain regions linked to working memory, a brain that was in overall size, average or even slightly smaller than typical, which on its own undercut any simple story about bigger meaning smarter. Almost every one of these findings came from a single specimen, examined at different times, by different teams, working from tissue that had already passed through decades of improvised handling before any of them ever got to look at it. None of these studies ever definitively proved that Einstein's brain was structurally responsible for his genius. What they mostly demonstrated, taken together, was how much scientific value had likely been lost simply because the specimen spent its first 3 decades in the informal custody of one man, moving from state to state in the back of a car, rather than under any kind of institutional research protocol from the start. By the 1990s, Thomas Harvey was in his 80s, still in possession of what remained of the tissue, still occasionally corresponding with the researchers who reached out to him. And it was during this period that one of the strangest chapters of the entire story took place. In 1997, a journalist named Michael Paterniti arranged to interview Harvey, and the two of them ended up driving across the United States together in Harvey's car, with the remaining pieces of Einstein's brain in the trunk, on a loosely defined cross-country trip that eventually brought them to California, to the home of Einstein's own granddaughter, Evelyn Einstein. The stated purpose, as later described, was something close to a gesture of closure, an aging Harvey, seemingly wanting to finally do right by the family after 4 decades, hoping to offer some of the material back, or at least to explain himself in person after all that time. For days, the two men drove west, Harvey now well into his 80s, the pieces of Einstein's brain still packed in that same unremarkable container in the back of the car, stopping along the way to visit other researchers who had, over the years, received small fragments of the specimen and were still, in their own scattered and disconnected ways, trying to study it. Evelyn Einstein, by most accounts, was not particularly interested in receiving it. She had a complicated relationship with the Einstein name to begin with, and the sudden appearance, on her doorstep, of an elderly stranger carrying pieces of her adoptive grandfather's brain in a car trunk was not, by any reasonable account, the kind of closure either of them had been hoping for. The visit reportedly did little to resolve anything, and the brain, or what remained of it, went back in the car for the drive home. The trip became the basis of Paternity's book, published a few years later, which turned Harvey from an obscure footnote into a recognizable, if strange, character in the public imagination, less a scientist than a man who had spent his entire adult life quietly guarding a secret in the trunk of his car, unable to either properly study it or let it go. Thomas Harvey died in 2007, at the age of 94. By that point, most of the remaining tissue and slides had finally been formally transferred to proper institutional care, including the National Museum of Health and Medicine, which holds a portion of the material to this day, along with several university research collections that had received samples over the decades. Einstein's brain, or what is left of it, now exists scattered across several institutions, in small, formally catalogued pieces, available in principle to legitimate researchers under actual ethical oversight. The very thing that never existed for the first 30 years after Thomas Harvey decided, alone, in a hospital basement, that he wasn't going to put it back. That oversight did not appear by accident, and it did not appear because of Harvey's case specifically. Through the 1960s and 70s, a series of separate medical scandals, cases where patients and research subjects had tissue, treatment, or entire courses of medical care, decided for them without real consent, gradually forced American medicine to build the formal ethical infrastructure that simply hadn't existed in 1955. By 1979, a federal report had laid out, for the first time in a systematic way, the specific principles that were supposed to govern research involving human subjects and human tissue: respect for individual autonomy, a genuine weighing of harm against benefit, and a real documented process of consent rather than an assumed one. None of that came in time to help Einstein's family or to give Thomas Harvey any clearer framework the day he made his decision. But it means that the specific failure at the center of this story, one man alone deciding on his own authority that a piece of another human being belonged to him now, is far harder to simply repeat today, at least inside any properly regulated institution. Modern research ethics boards exist, in large part, because for most of medical history, the only thing standing between a body and a curious pathologist's own judgment was that pathologist's own conscience. In 1955, in a basement in Princeton, that turned out not to be enough. It is worth asking honestly what actually drove a competent, unremarkable pathologist to make a decision like that, and then to spend the rest of his life unable to either use what he'd taken or give it back. Harvey never described himself as trying to steal anything. By most surviving accounts, including his own occasional interviews, he seemed to genuinely believe he was preserving something historically important, something too significant to simply be reduced to ash along with the rest of the body. That belief may even have been sincere. But sincerity is not the same as authority, and Harvey never actually had the authority to make that choice, for the family or for science, or for Einstein himself, who had been entirely explicit about what he wanted done with his remains. What's left, in the end, is a strange kind of monument to the specific pull that genius exerts on the people around it, the sense, for at least one man, that a piece of an extraordinary mind was too important to simply let go, even if he never had any real plan for what to do with it once he'd taken it, and even if the man himself had asked, quite clearly, to be left in peace. Dr. Marrow, subscribe. And next time someone tells you they only want to preserve something for the sake of history, ask them who actually gave them permission.